The world ended for Evelyn Harper on a Tuesday. It did not end with the fire and brimstone promised in the Sunday sermons, but with the quiet final click of a door, and the cold pronouncement of Mrs. Gable, the matron of the St. Jude's Foundling Home. "You are 18 now, Evelyn," the woman said, her voice as starched and unforgiving as her collar. "The home has fulfilled its Christian duty. A position has been arranged for you." Evelyn stood in the small gray office. Her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. For 12 years, since she'd been left on the steps as a child of 6, these gray walls had been her entire world. It had not been a kind world, but it had been a predictable one. Now the ground was vanishing beneath her feet. "A position," she repeated, her voice a whisper. "As a governess, a maid." Mrs. Gable's thin lips pressed into a line of distaste. "A wife," she said, the word landing like a stone in the suffocating silence. "Mr. Jedediah Fitch, the owner of the lumber mill, has made a generous offer. He is a man of standing, a widower. He requires a woman to keep his home and warm his bed." A cold dread, slick and oily, seeped into Evelyn's bones. She knew Mr. Fitch. Every girl in town knew him. He was a man well past 50, with a belly that strained the buttons of his waistcoat and teeth stained brown from chewing tobacco. His eyes, small and dark, had a way of lingering on a girl, stripping her bare right there on the dusty main street. He had buried 2 wives already, the whispers said. One from a fever, the other from a fall down a flight of stairs she had supposedly navigated every day for 10 years. "No," Evelyn breathed. The word was an act of rebellion, perhaps the first true one of her life. Mrs. Gable's eyes narrowed. "You are in no position to refuse. You have no family, no funds, no prospects. It is this, or you are out on the street by week's end. Mr. Fitch is a benefactor to this institution. We cannot afford to offend him." The finality of it was a physical blow. She was a piece of property to be traded for patronage. That night, Evelyn lay on her narrow cot, listening to the snores and whimpers of the younger girls in the dormitory, and felt a terror so profound it stole her breath. She saw her future spooling out before her, a life of silent servitude to a man whose touch would make her skin crawl, her spirit slowly eroding until she was as gray and lifeless as the walls of the orphanage. Escape. The word was a frantic drum beat in her heart. But escape to where? To what? The answer came 2 days later. On a page of the Boston Herald used to wrap a parcel of donated shoes. Tucked away in the classifieds. Amongst advertisements for farm equipment and miracle tonics was a small stark block of text. Mail order, bride needed, sheriff, widower for children, quiet homestead, Western Territory. The words were plain, devoid of romance or promise. Yet to Evelyn they shone like a beacon in the encroaching darkness. A sheriff, a man of the law. That implied a degree of honor, did it not? A widower with 4 children. That spoke of a life already lived, of sorrow perhaps, but also of a need for a mother, a homemaker, a quiet homestead after the constant noise and lack of privacy of the orphanage. The word quiet sounded like a verse from a hymn in the Western Territory. It was a blank map, a place so far away that the shadow of Jedediah Fitch could not possibly reach her. It was a desperate gamble, a leap into an unknown abyss, but it was her leap. Using the last of the pitiful savings she'd hoarded from mending clothes, she paid for a reply to be telegraphed. It was short, stripped of everything but the essential Evelyn Harper, age 18, except position, arriving as soon as possible. She received no reply. There was no welcoming letter, no reassurance. There was only a one-way train ticket paid for by a Mr. N. Cole of Ash Hollow that arrived in a plain envelope a week later. It was enough. Evelyn packed her few belongings, 2 worn dresses, a Bible, and a small wooden bird her own mother had carved for her into a battered carpet bag. She left in the dead of night without a word to anyone. A ghost slipping away from a life that was about to become a grave. The journey was a 2-week-long crucible that scoured her clean of the east. The train was the first part, a clattering, smoke-belching beast that carried her away from rolling green hills into a landscape that grew progressively flatter, drier, and emptier. The world outside the soot-streaked window bled from green to brown to a burnt orange. Towns became smaller, farther apart, clinging to the rails like desperate survivors. Then came the stagecoach. It was a bone-jarring, suffocating box on wheels, drawn by 6 dust-caked horses. Evelyn was crammed inside with a silent prospector who smelled of whiskey and regret and a woman in black bombazine who fanned herself constantly and sighed about the godforsaken heat. The dust was a living entity. It coated her tongue, gritted in her eyes, and settled in a fine red layer over her dark dress. The sun was a merciless hammer against the canvas roof. Outside, the world was vast and terrifyingly empty. The sky was an immense pale bowl that dwarfed the flat, cracked earth stretching to the horizon. Strange skeletal plants dotted the landscape, and occasionally a range of distant purple mountains shimmered in the heat haze. It was a land that did not care if you lived or died. It was raw, powerful, and utterly indifferent. The isolation was more profound than any she had ever known. Here a person could scream and the only thing to hear it would be the wind. It was in this great terrifying silence that Evelyn Harper truly understood she was alone. Ash Hollow was not so much a town as a scar on the face of the desert. A single wide street of sun-bleached false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a church whose steeple seemed to be pleading with the unforgiving sky as the stagecoach creaked to a halt in a cloud of dust. The town seemed to hold its breath. Faces appeared in windows. Men paused on the boardwalk, their conversations dying. They were all looking at her. Evelyn stepped down onto the dusty street, her legs unsteady, the stares of the townsfolk feeling like physical touches. And then she saw him. He was leaning against the support post of the sheriff's office, a tall, broad-shouldered man who seemed carved from the harsh landscape itself. He was not wearing a badge, but she knew instantly it was him. Sheriff Nathaniel Cole. He was older than she'd pictured. Lines were carved around his eyes and mouth, testament to sun and sorrow. His dark hair was threaded with gray at the temples, and his jaw was set in a permanent, unyielding line. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, shadowed gray, and they watched her approach with an unnerving stillness, an expression so full of weariness it felt ancient. There was no welcome in them. There was nothing at all but a deep, abiding quiet. He pushed himself off the post as she stopped before him, his height forcing her to crane her neck. "Miss Harper," he said. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. It was not unkind, but it was as devoid of warmth as his gaze. "Sheriff Cole," she managed, her own voice sounding thin and childish. 4 pairs of eyes were staring at her from behind him, peeking from the doorway of the office. Children, 2 boys, a girl, and a smaller girl who clutched a fistful of a boy's trousers. The eldest boy, perhaps 14, had his father's dark hair and a look of open hostility on his face. The younger boy's expression was one of wary curiosity. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 8, hid half her face, her eyes wide and frightened. The littlest one, barely a toddler, just stared, her thumb in her mouth. This was her new family. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. From the general store across the street, Evelyn could hear the murmur of voices, the word bride drifting on the hot air like a thrown stone. "The wagon's this way," the sheriff said. Finally, turning without another word. He loaded her single bag onto the back of a buckboard wagon as if it weighed nothing. The children scrambled aboard, settling in the back like a flock of wary sparrows, their eyes never leaving her. The eldest boy didn't move to help her up. It was the sheriff who offered a hand. His palm was rough, calloused, and strong. The brief touch sent a strange, unexpected jolt through her. The ride to the homestead was short and silent. The landscape around Ash Hollow was even more barren than the plain she had crossed. The soil was pale and dusty, dotted with sagebrush and skeletal-looking yucca. The Cole homestead was a testament to a long, hard-fought battle against this land. The house was a simple 2-story wooden structure, its paint peeled away by sun and wind. A barn stood nearby, its roof slightly sagging, a few chickens scratched in the dirt of the yard, and a single stubborn-looking cow watched them from a fenced-in patch of dry grass. The whole place looked exhausted, beaten down by the elements. It did not look like a home. It looked like a temporary shelter. Inside the house was suffocatingly quiet. It was clean, meticulously so, but stark and bare. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the scrubbed floorboards, no pictures on the walls. The air was heavy with a silence that felt older and deeper than the simple absence of noise. It was the silence of grief, of things left unsaid. The 4 children scattered the moment they were through the door, vanishing into the rooms of the house like mice into the walls, leaving Evelyn standing alone with the sheriff in the main room. "Your room is upstairs, first on the right," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "The children eat at 6 o'clock. I'll be back before then." And with that he turned and walked out, the front door closing with a soft but final click. Evelyn was left standing in the center of the silent house. She could feel the weight of it pressing in on her, the invisible presence of the woman who had lived and died here. She could feel the suspicious, resentful eyes of the children watching her from the shadows. This was not the quiet haven she had dreamed of. This was a house full of ghosts, both living and dead. Her room was as spare as the rest of the house, a narrow bed with a patched quilt, a small washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a single window that looked out over the endless dusty expanse. It was a cell. That night was the longest of her life. She lay in the strange bed, fully clothed under the quilt, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of the wind as it slid around the corners of the house. A low mournful moan. Sometime deep in the night she heard a child's cry. A thin, heartbroken wail that was quickly muffled. Then footsteps, heavy and slow, pacing in the hallway. Nathaniel's later, she rose and went to the window. In the pale moonlight she saw him. He was walking the perimeter of the property, a lantern in one hand, a rifle in the other. He moved with a quiet, restless energy. His silhouette a dark, lonely figure against the vast stardust sky. He was not merely checking his property. He was on patrol. He was a sentry guarding against some unseen, unnamed enemy. A chilling realization settled over Evelyn Harper. Cold and sharp as a shard of ice. She had fled a brute only to land in a fortress. This quiet homestead, this place she had hoped would be a sanctuary, was not safe. It was a battleground and she was standing right in the middle of it. Life on the Cole homestead began before the sun with the crow of a rooster and the chill of the floorboards against the soles of Evelyn's feet. The first morning she had ventured into the kitchen, a room dominated by a large black cast-iron stove that looked more like an instrument of torture than a means of cooking. She had tried to make a proper breakfast, a gesture of peace and purpose. It was a disaster. The salt pork cut too thick, burned to a black crisp on one side while remaining stubbornly raw on the other. The biscuits she attempted from a sack of coarse flour were dense. Heavy things that could have served as door stops. She had placed the meager, unappetizing meal on the rough-hewn table, just as Nathaniel and the children filed in. No one spoke. The sheriff sat at the head of the table, his movements economical and precise. He put 2 of the charred biscuits on his plate, poured molasses over them, and ate without a change in his grim expression. The children followed his lead. The eldest boy, whose name she'd learned was Jacob, shot her a look of pure contempt before poking at his food. Samuel, the quieter boy of about 11, simply ate, his eyes downcast. Clara, the 8-year-old girl with her mother's wide, dark eyes, pushed a piece of pork around her plate, her small face a mask of misery. Only little 4-year-old Hannah, too young for judgment, chewed happily on a piece of biscuit, oblivious to the oppressive tension. The silence was so complete that the scrape of a fork against a plate sounded like a gunshot. It was in that silence that Evelyn understood her role here was not simply to cook and clean. It was to fill a void so large and so deep it had swallowed all the sound in the house. Her day settled into a rhythm of relentless, back-breaking labor. She learned to haul water from the deep well, her arms and back screaming in protest. She learned to feed the chickens and hunt for their eggs, to milk the single melancholic cow. She spent hours in the small sunshed vegetable patch behind the house, coaxing stubborn life from the dry, cracked earth. The work was a kind of brutal solace when she was pulling weeds or scrubbing the floors on her hands and knees. She was too exhausted to think, too sore to feel the knowing loneliness. The children remained a fortress she could not breach. Jacob, at 14, was his father's shadow. A boy forced into manhood too soon. He spoke to her only when necessary, his answers clipped and dismissive. He looked at her not as a person, but as an unwanted intrusion, a stranger at his mother's table. Samuel was more of a mystery. He was a watcher, his eyes following her with a quiet, unreadable intensity. He did his chores without complaint and disappeared for hours, exploring the arid gullies beyond the homestead. Clara was a ghost. She would flit from a room the moment Evelyn entered, and if their paths crossed, she would press herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible, her eyes wide with a fear Evelyn couldn't comprehend. Only little Hannah, with the innocent selfishness of a small child, would occasionally allow Evelyn into her world, tugging on her skirt for a drink of water or holding up a smooth rock she had found. These small moments were like finding a sip of cool water in the middle of the desert. They were just enough to keep her from collapsing from thirst. Once a week, Nathaniel would drive the buckboard into Ash Hollow for supplies. The first time Evelyn accompanied him, she felt the town's collective gaze settle upon her like a physical weight. Women stopped sweeping their porches to watch her pass. Men on the boardwalk fell silent, their eyes following her. She was a curiosity, the mail-order bride, the replacement. In the general store, a stout woman with a floral bonnet and piercing eyes. "Mrs. Peterson," greeted the sheriff with a familiarity that spoke of years. "Sheriff," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Then she turned to Evelyn. "And this must be the new Mrs. Cole." The word new hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Miss Harper, Nathaniel corrected her, his voice flat. We ain't married yet. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows shot up. Oh well, a brave girl you are coming all this way to take on such a burden. Her gaze flickered towards the sacks of flour and sugar. For children and after such a tragedy. Poor Sarah. It was a blessing. She went quick. A fall like that terrible thing. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisperer. Right down the main stairs in her own home. Some say it was her heart that gave out first. Just stopped. Unusual for a healthy woman. Evelyn felt a chill despite the stifling heat of the store. The woman's words were laced with insinuation, a poison she was trying to drip into Evelyn's ear. She looked at Nathaniel, but his face was an unreadable mask as he loaded their supplies. He seemed deaf to the whispers, or perhaps he was simply used to them. The whispers took on a darker, more menacing form later that afternoon. As they were preparing to leave, a man stumbled out of the saloon, his face flushed with cheap whiskey. He was gaunt with wild, haunted eyes. He staggered towards the wagon, pointing a trembling finger at Evelyn. There she is, he slurred, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone on the street. The new lamb for the slaughter. Nathaniel, who had been tying down a sack of grain, straightened up slowly. His body went rigid, and a stillness came over him that was more frightening than any shout. Go home, Silas, Nathaniel said, his voice dangerously low. The man ignored him, his wild eyes fixed on Evelyn. You listen to me, girlie, he spat. Flecks of spittle landing on the dusty ground. You think you're safe with him? He's the devil himself. He'll put you in the ground just like he did the other one. You'll be the second. The second. Before Evelyn could even process the words, Nathaniel moved. He crossed the space between them in 2 long silent strides. He didn't punch the man. He simply grabbed him by the front of his shirt, lifted him nearly off his feet, and slammed him against the wall of the saloon. The sound was a sickening thud of bone and muscle hitting wood. I told you to go home, Nathaniel growled, his face inches from the drunks. The man whimpered, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a pathetic liquor-fueled terror. Nathaniel held him there for a long moment, then let him go. The man, Silas, crumpled to the ground in a heap, sobbing. Nathaniel turned his back on him and walked back to the wagon as if nothing had happened, his expression unchanged. He did not look at Evelyn. He did not offer a word of explanation. He simply clicked the res and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the whispers and the warnings behind in the dusty street. The house felt different after that. The silence was no longer just empty. It was filled with unspoken questions. The word second echoed in Evelyn's mind. She started seeing shadows in every corner, imagining a ghostly presence watching her. One afternoon, while trying to air out the musty parlor, a room the family never used, she found it. A heavy oak wardrobe stood against the far wall. Driven by a desperate need to bring some light and air into the stagnant space. She struggled to move it aside to clean behind it. As she pushed it inch by inch, something fell from the wall behind it. It was a framed portrait. She knelt and picked it up. It was the woman from the town's whispers, Sarah Cole. She was beautiful, with a cascade of dark hair and a smile that seemed both gentle and full of life. Her eyes, the same dark eyes as her daughter Clara's, seemed to look right at Evelyn. But it was the canvas itself that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. A single violent slash made by a sharp knife ran diagonally across the woman's painted face from her temple to her chin. The cut was deep, a scar of rage on a memory of beauty. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Who would do such a thing? The drunk Silas, an enemy of the sheriff, or the sheriff himself in a fit of rage or grief? She quickly hung the portrait back on its nail and shoved the heavy wardrobe back into place, her hands trembling. The house now held a tangible piece of evidence of the violence that lurked just beneath its silent surface. Nathaniel remained a distant, enigmatic figure. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending to the livestock, and riding out on long patrols, his rifle always resting in the crook of his arm. He rarely spoke to her, and when he did, it was to give a curt instruction. Yet Evelyn began to notice small things. She would be hanging laundry on the line, the wind whipping her skirts around her ankles, and she would feel a prickling on the back of her neck. She would turn, and for a split second she would see him, paused in his work by the barn, watching her. His expression was always the same, a deep, troubled concentration, as if she were a puzzle he could not solve. The moment their eyes met, he would look away, his jaw tightening, and return to his work with a renewed, almost furious energy. The distance between them was a vast, arid canyon. And then one day it was bridged in a single heart-topping second. She was coming back from the well, carrying 2 heavy buckets of water, her arms straining. The ground near the pump was always damp and a patch of dark. Slick mud had formed. Her worn-out shoe slipped. For a moment she was suspended in air, the world tilting sideways. A cry escaped her lips as she felt herself falling backward, bracing for the hard, jarring impact with the ground. It never came. Suddenly, a solid force was there, stopping her fall. 2 strong hands grabbed her upper arms, steadying her. Nathaniel, he had been coming from the barn and had moved with a speed she wouldn't have thought possible. The buckets clattered to the ground, water splashing over their boots. He held her there, his grip firm, pulling her upright until she was pressed against his chest. The world stopped. All she was aware of was the solid wall of his body, the surprising heat of it through his rough cotton shirt. She could feel the hard, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. He smelled of sun, dust, and something uniquely his own, something like leather and clean sweat. She lifted her head and her face was only inches from his. She saw the shock in his gray eyes. A flicker of something she had never seen there before. Not anger, not weariness, but something raw and unguarded. The moment stretched for an eternity, silent and charged. He was holding her and she was letting him. It was the first time they had touched for more than a fleeting, functional second. It was not a gentle touch, but it was not violent either. It was sure protective. Then, as quickly as it had happened, it was over. He released her and took a half step back, the canyon opening up between them once more. A dark flush crept up his neck. He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the spilled water. "There's a loose stone there," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Need to fix it." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing there trembling, her heart racing not from the near fall, but from the sudden shocking jolt of his touch. That night, Evelyn lay in her bed and felt a war raging inside her. She was afraid. She was afraid of the whispers of the slashed portrait of the silent, brooding man who patrolled his land with a rifle. But she also felt a deep, aching pity for him, for the sorrow that radiated from him like cold from a block of ice. And beneath it all, there was something new, something terrifying and confusing that had been born in that brief moment he held her. It was a flicker of warmth in the desolate landscape of her heart. A cow-caught coin. A longing for the touch of the very man she feared might be a monster. The fire started just after midnight. A malevolent orange bloom against the ink-black canvas of the prairie sky. It was a smell that woke Evelyn first. Acrid smoke, sharp and invasive, a scent of disaster. She was out of her bed in an instant, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. From her window she saw it. Flames were licking at the dry timber of the barn, greedily consuming the structure that was the lifeblood of their meager homestead. She met Nathaniel on the stairs. He was already pulling on his boots. His face a grim mask illuminated by the flickering hellish light from outside. He didn't need to say a word. The look in his eyes was one of a commander facing a battle he was already losing. "The children," he rasped. "Keep them in the house." But Jacob was already there, his face pale with a mixture of fear and grim determination. A bucket in his hand. "I can help." Nathaniel gave a sharp nod. "Evelyn, the well now." What followed was a desperate, chaotic ballet of survival. The roar of the fire was a living thing, a hungry beast that crackled and spat. The heat was a physical blow, searing her skin even from a distance. Evelyn worked like she never had before, her movements fueled by pure adrenaline. She cranked the handle of the well, her muscles screaming as she hauled up bucket after bucket. Nathaniel and Jacob, their faces black with soot, would grab them from her, running towards the inferno to throw the pitifully small amounts of water against an enemy of impossible scale. They worked in a frantic, silent rhythm, a small, determined army against annihilation. Evelyn's lungs burned. Her eyes streamed from the smoke. Her dress was soaked, her hair plastered to her forehead. She lost track of time, lost track of everything but the rhythmic squeal of the well pulley, the slosh of water, the desperate race back and forth. At one point, a burning timber crashed from the roof of the barn, sending a shower of sparks into the night. One landed on the sleeve of her dress, which began to smolder before she could even cry out. Nathaniel was there, smothering the ember with his bare hands, his expression fierce and focused. He looked at her then, his gray eyes cutting through the smoky haze. A silent question. Are you all right? She could only nod, her throat too raw to speak. They didn't save the barn. They couldn't. But they saved the house. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the devastated landscape, the fire finally exhausted itself, leaving behind the blackened skeletal remains of the barn, still smoking and sighing in the morning air. They collapsed in the kitchen. 3 soot-stained, exhausted figures. Jacob, looking years older than his 14 years, soon stumbled off to his bed. Evelyn and Nathaniel were left alone at the table, the silence of the house pressing in around them. The shared battle had stripped away the layers of formality and distance between them. In the grime and exhaustion, they were just a man and a woman who had fought together. "You were good out there," Nathaniel said, his voice a low growly thing. He was staring into a tin cup of water, but she knew he was seeing the fire. "I was scared," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I've never seen anything like that. Fear keeps you alive." He took a long drink of water. "Gets you moving." She watched him the way the early morning light carved new lines of exhaustion onto his face. "I'm sorry about the barn, about the hay, the tools." He shook his head, a slow, weary gesture. "We'll rebuild. Wood and nails can be replaced." He finally looked at her, and for the first time the guard in his eyes was down. He just looked tired, down to his very bones. "You never should have had to see that." A strange impulse made her speak. "It's all right. I don't have much to lose." The words were out before she could stop them. They hung in the air between them, stark and true. "At the orphanage we had nothing that was truly ours. So we never had to fear losing it, just being lost ourselves." She told him then in a quiet, halting voice about her life, about the gray walls and the endless routine, about the knowing loneliness of being a nameless, faceless child among many. She told him of her one simple dream, a window to look out of that was her own, a door she could close, a place where she belonged. She did not tell him about Mr. Fitch. The shame of it was still a raw wound, but she told him enough. He listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on her face. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was softer, filled with a shared understanding. "I was a U.S. Marshal," he said suddenly, the words seeming to be pulled from a deep locked place inside him. "Before I was sheriff here, before Sarah, before this," he rubbed a hand over his face, over the old scars and the new weariness. "I tracked men across the territories. Hard men saw things a man isn't meant to see. War teaches you how to kill. Being a marshal teaches you that some men are born liking it." He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. "You carry it with you. The ghosts. You think you can leave them behind on some dusty trail, but they follow you home. They sit at your table." He was talking about more than just his job. He was talking about the shadows in his own soul, the violence he kept leashed inside him. He was giving her a piece of his past, a piece of his pain. It was the most valuable thing he had offered her since she'd arrived. The emotional and physical toll of the night suddenly crashed down on Evelyn. Her head grew heavy, her eyelids drooping, the world softened at the edges. She heard Nathaniel's voice continue, a low rumble, but the words blurred. She rested her head on her arms on the table, just for a moment, and plunged into an abyss of sleep. She awoke with a start some time later. The sun was higher in the sky, streaming through the kitchen window. She was still at the table, but a thick woolen blanket was draped gently over her shoulders. Nathaniel was gone, but on the stove, a pot of coffee was warming, and a plate with a piece of cornbread was sitting on the table beside her. It was a gesture of such simple, profound care that it brought a lump to her throat. He had watched her sleep. He had covered her. He had left her food in the ashes of the barn. Something new and fragile was beginning to take root. The fire changed them. The physical barrier of the barn was gone, and it felt as if an emotional one had burned down with it. Evelyn found herself watching him, not with fear, but with a burgeoning, complicated tenderness. She saw the way he checked the horizon at dusk, the way his hand would unconsciously rest on the worn butt of his holstered pistol. She saw the exhaustion that never quite left his eyes. And she began to dream of him, not dreams of a cold sheriff, but of the man who had smothered a spark on her sleeve with his bare hands, the man who had covered her with a blanket as she slept. A week later she had to ride into Ash Hollow for thread and salt. Nathaniel was busy clearing the wreckage of the barn, so Jacob drove her in, his silence as sullen and thick as ever. While Jacob was at the blacksmith's, Evelyn went to the general store. As she came out, her small parcel clutched in her hand. Her path was blocked by 2 young men. They were cowhands, barely older than she was, with arrogant smirks and cruel eyes. "Well, now look what we have here," the taller one said, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her feel dirty. "The sheriff's little mail order package." "Leave me alone," Evelyn said, trying to step around them. The second one, stockier and with a mean-looking scar on his cheek, moved to block her again. "What's the hurry? A pretty thing like you must get lonely out there with that old man and all them kids. Maybe you need a real man to show you a good time." He reached out to grab her arm. Evelyn flinched back, her heart pounding with a familiar, sickening dread. "Don't touch me." "Or what?" The first one sneered, stepping closer. "You going to have that broken-down lawman come after us?" "You won't have to." The voice was quiet, cold, and right behind them. The two cowhands froze. They turned slowly, their smirks vanishing, replaced by a pasty-faced fear. Nathaniel stood there. He must have finished his work early and followed them into town. He hadn't ridden the horse that he had walked up on them as silently as a predator. "She told you to leave her alone," Nathaniel said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The tall cowhand, trying to regain some of his bravado, puffed out his chest. "Now see here, Sheriff, we was just having a bit of fun." He never finished the sentence. Nathaniel's fist moved in a short, brutal arc. It wasn't a wild swing. It was a precise, economical motion that ended with a sickening crack as his knuckles connected with the man's jaw. The cowhand's head snapped back and he crumpled to the boardwalk like a sack of grain. Unconscious, the second man stared, his mouth agape in horror. He looked from his friend on the ground to Nathaniel's cold, gray eyes. He let out a small, terrified squeak, turned, and scrambled away, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape. The street had gone silent. From the wagon, Evelyn could see the wide, frightened eyes of Jacob. He had seen the whole thing. He was staring at his father as if he were a stranger. Nathaniel didn't look at the man on the ground. He looked at Evelyn. "Get in the wagon," he said, his voice tight. He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid. As he passed her, Evelyn saw it. His hand, the one he had struck the man with, was trembling, not with rage but with the effort of controlling it. He wasn't just a man of violence. He was a man at war with the violence inside him. And in that moment, her fear was completely eclipsed by a wave of overwhelming, heart-wrenching compassion. The ride home was silent, but this time it was a taut, humming silence, charged with the energy of what had just happened. That evening the storm broke. The sky, which had been a bruised purple all afternoon, opened up. Rain came down in solid driving sheets and the wind howled like a banshee. In the middle of dinner, a powerful gust of wind ripped a shutter from one of the upstairs windows with a loud crack. "Jacob, with me," Nathaniel commanded. They went out into the mastrom to secure what was left of the homestead. Evelyn was left inside with the younger children, who were whimpering in fear of the thunder. After settling them, she found herself drawn to the back door, peering out into the tempest. She saw Nathaniel struggling with a large piece of canvas, trying to cover a hole in the chicken coop roof. On impulse, she grabbed a heavy oilskin coat and ran out into the rain. The wind and water hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. She reached him, and together they fought the flapping canvas, the wind trying to tear it from their grasp. Finally, they managed to secure it with heavy stones, drenched and breathless. Nathaniel motioned for her to get back inside. He pointed to the small, sturdy root cellar. Its slanted doors banging in the wind. "The latch is loose. It'll rip the doors off." He yelled over the roar of the storm. They ran for it together, huddling in the small, protected space of the cellar's entrance. Nathaniel fumbled with the iron latch, his cold fingers struggling with the metal. Evelyn held the lantern high, its light flickering wildly. They were in a tiny enclosed world, the storm raging just beyond the doorway. He finally got the latch secured. He turned and they were suddenly face to face in the cramped space. The lantern light cast dramatic shadows across his face, highlighting the hard lines of his jaw and the deep-set weariness in his eyes. Rain dripped from his hair and ran in rivulets down his face. She could see the pulse beating in his throat. All the unspoken things between them, the fire, the confession, the violence in town. The trembling hand rose up and filled the small space until the air was too thick to breathe. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers, and she saw a storm in them that rivaled the one outside. He raised a hand slowly as if it weighed 1,000 pounds and gently brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle against her skin. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of a dam breaking after years of holding back a flood. It was rough and hungry, tasting of rain and pent-up loneliness. Evelyn's mind went blank. All she could do was feel. She felt the surprising softness of his lips, the rough scrape of his stubble, the strength in the hand that came up to cup the back of her head, pulling her closer. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his wet shirt, and kissed him back with all the confusion and fear and desperate aching longing that had been growing inside her since the day she arrived. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by darkness and chaos, they found each other. The kiss did not end in the root cellar. It lingered in the air between them. A silent crackling charge that followed them back into the house. The storm raged outside, but a more turbulent one had been unleashed within the quiet walls of the homestead. They moved around the kitchen, drying themselves with rough towels. The simple domestic act made strange and clumsy by a new profound awareness of each other. Every accidental brush of his arm against hers was a jolt of lightning. Every time their eyes met, the memory of the kiss, the desperation, the raw hunger was there. A shared secret that was both thrilling and terrifying. He was the first to retreat. The fire in his eyes was banked, replaced by a shuttered, guarded look that was colder than any she had seen before. He built a wall of silence, brick by painstaking brick. "The storm will pass by morning," he said, his voice strained, his gaze fixed on the rain-lashing window. "You should get some sleep." It was a dismissal. The days that followed were a quiet, agonizing torture for Evelyn. Nathaniel became a ghost in his own home. He rose before she did, gone from the house by the time she came downstairs, and returned long after she had put the younger children to bed. His face etched with a fatigue that seemed more soul-deep than physical. He threw himself into the monumental task of rebuilding the barn, working with a frantic, punishing energy, as if he could physically exhaust the memory of what had passed between them. When she brought him his midday meal, he would take it with a mumbled thanks, his eyes never meeting hers, his whole body angled away from her. The distance was a chasm, wider and more painful than the one that had existed when she first arrived. Then he had been a stranger. Now he was a man whose kiss had branded her, and his rejection was a constant, dull ache in her chest. She felt like a fool, a naive, lonely girl who had mistaken a moment of storm-fueled desperation for something more. She was heartbroken. But a stubborn resolve began to harden inside her. She would not crumble. She had survived St. Jude's. She had survived the journey west. She would survive this quiet, agonizing war. She continued her work, her hands growing rougher, her back stronger. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended the garden, and she tried with a patience she didn't know she possessed to win over the children. Her breakthrough came not with the boys but with Clara. One afternoon, Evelyn found the girl sitting behind the chicken coop, weeping silently, clutching a small rag doll with one button eye. "What is it, Clara?" Evelyn asked softly, kneeling in the dirt. The girl shook her head, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "It's Mama's birthday," she whispered, her voice choked with grief. "We always picked the wild primroses for her." Evelyn's heart ached. In this house of silent, stoic men, the girl's grief had no outlet. "I don't know where those flowers are," Evelyn said gently. "But I know how to make a Johnny cake with molasses. Your mama liked that, didn't she?" Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know?" "Your father mentioned it once." Evelyn lied. "Come, you can help me." That afternoon, for the first time, Clara stayed by her side in the kitchen, her small hands helping to stir the batter. And when Nathaniel came in that evening, a Johnny cake was on the table. He stopped, his eyes falling on the simple cake. A flicker of emotion, pain, memory, something crossed his face before he masked it. But that night, as Evelyn passed Clara's room, she heard the girl talking to her doll. "The new lady made Mama's cake," she whispered. "She's not so bad." Evelyn's search for understanding led her to the attic. It was a hot, stuffy space under the eaves, filled with the dust of forgotten years. She was looking for spare blankets, but she was also looking for Sarah, for some piece of the woman whose ghost still walked the halls of this house in a large leather-strapped trunk tucked under a dusty canvas. She found it tucked beneath folded baby clothes and a pair of tiny worn leather shoes, was a small leather-bound book, a diary. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was elegant, a looping, feminine script so different from the harsh, practical world outside. The early entries were filled with love and hope. She wrote of her love for Nathaniel, my steady, quiet rock, and her joy in her children. She wrote of the hardships of homesteading, but her tone was one of resilience and optimism. Then the tone began to change. The entries grew shorter, the script tighter, more anxious. October 12, 1887. Nathaniel wrote out again today. He says it is just patrol, but I see the look in his eyes when he returns. The same look he had when he was a marshal. He is hunting for something or someone. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She flipped forward, her fingers clumsy. November 3, 1887. A man was in town today, a drunkard. Nathaniel threw him out of the saloon. When he came home, the look on his face was terrible. I asked who it was. He would not say the name, only that it was a ghost from his past. I have never seen him so angry. It was a cold, quiet anger, the kind that frightens me. Evelyn knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone who the man was. Silas, the drunk who had accosted her. She continued to read, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. November 10, 1887. I heard Nathaniel talking to Jacob in the barn. He was teaching him to shoot the new rifle. He said, "A man has to know how to protect his own. Jacob is only a boy. What is he so afraid of? What is coming for us?" And then the final entry. The ink was slightly blurred as if by tears. January 5, 1888. He told me the name tonight. Silas Boone, a man he captured years ago. An outlaw. Nathaniel said he did things to him during the interrogation, things the law doesn't approve of, to get the names of his gang before they took him away. Boone looked at him and said, "I'll be back, Marshal. I'll wait. And when I come back, I'll take everything you love and put it in the ground right where you can see." Nathaniel thinks he has escaped the prison in Yuma. He says we are safe here. But I see the way he watches the horizon. He is not a sheriff protecting a town. He is a man waiting for a monster to come out of the darkness. And I am afraid. The diary ended there. Evelyn closed the book, her hands shaking. A fall like that. Unusual for a healthy woman. Mrs. Peterson's gossiping words echoed in her mind. It wasn't an accident. Sarah hadn't fallen. Evelyn was sure of it. Silas Boone had kept his promise. He had come back. And he had killed Nathaniel's wife. And Nathaniel was living with that knowledge, that guilt, every single day. The man wasn't cold. He was trapped in a living hell, a prison of his own making. Convinced that letting anyone close, letting her Karis close, was putting a target on their back. His avoidance wasn't a rejection of her. It was a desperate, misguided attempt to protect her. That night she waited for him. She sat in the dark kitchen, a single oil lamp casting a small golden pool of light on the table. The children were long asleep. The house was utterly still. She heard his footsteps on the porch just before midnight, heavy with exhaustion. He opened the door and stopped dead when he saw her sitting there. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice rough. "Waiting for you," she said simply. He avoided her eyes, moving to the wash basin to splash his face with cold water. "No need. Go to bed." "Nathaniel," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Who is Silas Boone?" He froze, his hands braced on the sides of the basin. His whole body went rigid. Slowly, he straightened up and turned to face her. In the lamplight, his face was a mask of anguish. The wall he had so carefully constructed crumbled into dust, leaving only a raw, exposed grief. "Where did you hear that name?" he whispered. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice softening. She was afraid of him, wasn't she? "Sarah?" He stared at her, and she saw the last of his defenses fall. He sank into the chair opposite her, the movement of a man surrendering. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with a silent, wrenching sob. Evelyn's heart broke for him. She rose and went to him, placing a hesitant hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and full of a self-loathing so profound it was terrifying. "It was my fault," he rasped. "All of it." And he told her everything. He told her about capturing Silas Boone, a man known for his cruelty, especially to women and children. He told her about the other members of Boone's gang who had scattered, and the pressure from his superiors to find them. He told her about the interrogation, about the days of depriving Boone of water and sleep, about the violence he had inflicted on the man in a desperate attempt to break him. "I broke him," Nathaniel said, his voice hollow. "I got the names. I became a hero. They called me the man who dismantled the Boone gang, but I broke something inside myself. I crossed a line. And he promised me he would make me pay." He told her how Boone had escaped a year later. How he had lived in constant fear, moving his family, quitting the marshals, and taking the quiet, dead-end job of sheriff in Ash Hollow, hoping to disappear. And then one day he had come home to find Sarah at the bottom of the stairs, her neck broken and a single withered primrose, the flower she had loved, placed on her chest. There was no proof, no witnesses, just the chilling, intimate knowledge that his ghost had come home and kept his promise. "I put her in the ground," he whispered, his eyes filled with a torment that stole Evelyn's breath. "My pride, my rage. I brought him here and now you." His voice broke. "That kiss. God help me. Evelyn, I am so sorry. I have no right to touch you. To even look at you. Everything I touch, I destroy. I can't. I won't let him have you too." The terrible, aching puzzle of Nathaniel Cole was finally complete. Evelyn knelt before him, taking his large, trembling hands in her own. They were the hands of a killer, a protector, a farmer, a father. They were the hands of a man drowning in grief. "You didn't destroy her," she said, her voice fierce. He did, and you are not going to let him destroy you or us. They sat like that for what felt like hours under the soft glow of the lamp, holding hands. It was not a lover's touch. It was the grip of two survivors clinging to a piece of wreckage in a storm. It was a silent vow, a promise that he was no longer alone in his prison. The first snow of winter began to fall that night. It came softly at first, then with a growing relentless fury. By the next day, a full-blown blizzard had descended upon the homestead, isolating them completely from the outside world. The wind howled, piling drifts of white against the doors and windows. They were trapped, a small island of life in a vast howling sea of white. The storm forced them into a proximity that was both a comfort and a sweet agony. They worked together to keep the livestock fed and the house warm. The tension between them was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the sharp edge of rejection, but the low hum of a shared dangerous secret and an unspoken burgeoning desire. That night, the storm reached its peak. The wind shrieked, rattling the very bones of the house. No one could sleep. Evelyn sat by the fire in the main room, wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames dance. One by one, the children, frightened by the storm, had crept from their beds to sleep on pallets near the hearth. Soon, only she and Nathaniel were awake. He sat in his chair across from her, cleaning his rifle. The methodical, repetitive clicks of the mechanism, the only sound besides the storm. He finished his work and looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the firelight. The space between them was filled with everything they had said and everything they hadn't. Evelyn knew with a certainty that came from the deepest part of her soul, that they couldn't go on like this. They couldn't live as ghosts in their own home, waiting for another ghost to come and destroy them. Life was too short, too brutal, and too precious. She rose from her spot on the floor and walked over to him. She knelt before his chair just as she had the night before. She took the rifle from his hands and set it carefully on the floor. Then she took his hands in hers. "You're not a ghost, Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "And neither am I. We're alive right here, right now." She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between his guilt and his own desperate human need. He started to pull away, to say her name in a tone of warning. But she didn't let him. She leaned forward and silenced him with a kiss. This kiss was different. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss in the storm. It was slow and deep and deliberate. It was a choice, her choice. It was a promise of solace, of understanding, of a shared warmth against the cold. He resisted for a moment, his body rigid with guilt. Then a shudder ran through him and he surrendered. He kissed her back, and all the pain, all the loneliness, all the fear he had carried for so long poured into it. His arms came around her, pulling her from her knees onto his lap, holding her as if he would never let her go. In the small warm room with the blizzard screaming outside and the children sleeping peacefully by the fire, Evelyn Harper and Nathaniel Cole crossed the final boundary. It was not an act of lust, but a profound, desperate connection. It was a defiant cry for life in the face of death. It was two lonely, broken souls finding an anchor in the storm, claiming a moment of grace and warmth and fierce, undeniable life for themselves before the ghosts of the past came to claim them. The world returned slowly, not with the shriek of the blizzard, but with the soft gray light of a snow-hushed dawn. Evelyn awoke to a profound stillness, the kind that only follows a great storm. She was cocooned in warmth, her head resting on the solid expanse of Nathaniel's chest, his arm a heavy protective weight around her. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a gentle rose-colored light on the sleeping forms of the children on the floor. In this quiet, insulated world, with the blizzard having sealed them off from everything else, it felt as if they were the only people left alive. She lay there, not daring to move, memorizing the feel of his steady breathing, the rough texture of his shirt against her cheek, the unfamiliar but deeply comforting scent of him. Last night had not been a dream. It had been a quiet, desperate collision of two souls, a claiming of life in the face of so much death. For the first time since she could remember, a fragile, tentative tendril of hope began to unfurl within her. She thought this could be a home. This could be a family. The illusion was shattered by the sound of a floorboard creaking at the top of the stairs. Evelyn's eyes flew open. Nathaniel stirred, his body tensing instinctively even in sleep. Standing there, silhouetted against the pale light of the upstairs window, was Jacob. He wasn't looking at the sleeping children by the fire. His gaze was fixed, laser-sharp, on the two of them in the armchair, on his father and on the woman in his father's arms. His face was pale, his expression a horrifying mixture of shock, disgust, and a deep wounded betrayal that cut Evelyn to the core. He had the look of a boy who had just watched his king and his castle burn to the ground. He didn't say a word. You didn't have to. The accusation in his eyes was a physical blow. He looked from his father's sleeping face to Evelyn's wide, terrified eyes, and his mouth tightened into a thin, hard line of judgment. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and vanished back into the shadows of the upper floor. Panic, cold and slick, seized Evelyn. She scrambled off Nathaniel's lap, her movements clumsy and loud in the stillness. Nathaniel came fully awake, his hand instinctively going for the pistol that was never far from his side. "What is it?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He saw us." The words hung in the air, extinguishing the last of the embers' warmth. Nathaniel's face hardened, the brief piece of sleep wiped away, replaced by the familiar weary mask of a man bracing for impact. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture full of a grim self-rimation. He had allowed himself one night of solace, and the price was already being tallied. The silence at the breakfast table was a weapon. Jacob sat with his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on his plate, radiating a cold, impenetrable fury. Samuel and Clara, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, were unnaturally quiet, their eyes darting nervously between their brother and their father. Nathaniel tried to act as if nothing was amiss, but his movements were stiff, his words clipped. The fragile truce Evelyn had built with the children had been annihilated. In Jacob's eyes, she was no longer the woman who fought fires and made Johnny cakes. She was a usurper, a home wrecker, a sinner who had defiled his mother's memory in the very heart of their home. The snow kept them locked in for 2 more days, 2 days of excruciating unspoken tension. When the paths were finally clear enough for travel, the need for supplies was urgent. Nathaniel announced he had to ride out to check on the outlying homesteads, leaving Evelyn with the necessary task of going into Ash Hollow. "Jacob will take you," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The wagon ride into town was the longest 4 miles of Evelyn's life. Jacob held the reins, his knuckles white, his jaw set so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her. He drove the wagon as if she were a sack of grain, a piece of cargo he was forced to transport the moment they arrived in Ash Hollow. Evelyn knew something was wrong. The town was alive with the kind of buzzing furtive energy that signals fresh gossip. As she stepped down from the wagon, conversations on the boardwalk stuttered and died. Women who had previously offered her curt but civil nods now looked straight through her or turned their backs pointedly as she passed. The stares were no longer curious. They were sharp, judgmental, and laced with a kind of smug satisfaction. Inside the general store, the chill was even more pronounced. Mrs. Peterson was behind the counter talking with 2 other women when Evelyn entered. Their conversation stopped abruptly. Mrs. Peterson's face, usually arranged in a mask of pleasantries, was cold and hard. "What do you need, Miss Harper?" she asked, her voice clipped. She made a great show of wiping down the already clean counter as if to scrub away Evelyn's presence. "Flour, sugar, and coffee, please," Evelyn said, her voice sounding small and weak. One of the other women, a thin, sharp-faced woman Evelyn recognized from church, let out a small, derisive sniff. "Some people have no shame," she muttered to her companion, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "Coming into a decent town, carrying on like that, under a sheriff's roof no less, with his motherless children." The blood drained from Evelyn's face. She felt dizzy, her cheeks burning as if she'd been slapped. How could they possibly know the blizzard? No one had been out to the homestead. Then she looked past them through the store's front window and saw Jacob talking to 2 boys his age near the blacksmith's forge. He was talking with a bitter, angry energy, gesturing back towards the store. He had told them his pain and anger had been so great that he had betrayed his own family, flinging their private shame into the public square for all to peck at. The ride home was another silent, agonizing journey. The shame was so thick in Evelyn's throat she could barely breathe. She had come here to build a respectable life, to escape being an outcast. Now in this tiny, isolated town, she was more of a pariah than ever before. The consequences arrived the next day in the form of a black lacquered buggy pulled by a handsome gray mare. It was the finest carriage in Ash Hollow, and it belonged to Mrs. Albright, the wife of the circuit preacher. She was the town's undisputed moral authority, a woman whose piety was matched only by her wealth. She did not come alone. The sharp-faced woman from the store was with her. Nathaniel met them on the porch. He stood tall and unmoving, a bulwark against their righteous invasion. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. "Sheriff Cole," Mrs. Albright began, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "We have come on a most delicate matter. It has come to our attention, the entire town's attention. In fact, that your domestic situation is unsuitable. My domestic situation is my own business, ma'am, Nathaniel said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Not when it involves the immortal souls of children. Sheriff, the woman retorted, her voice hardening. We understand your grief, your loneliness, but to bring a woman of loose morals into your home, to flaunt your sin before those innocent eyes is an abomination. The town will not stand for it. Get to your point, Mrs. Albright. The woman drew herself up to her full formidable height. My point, Sheriff, is that Clara and little Hannah require a proper Christian upbringing, an environment free from corruption. My husband and I are prepared to take them in to raise them as our own until you can find a more appropriate wife. The world tilted. Evelyn felt the floor drop out from under her. They were going to take the children. Her sin, her one night of desperate human connection, was going to cost her the very family she had come to love. She saw Nathaniel's hand drop to the butt of his pistol, a muscle in his jaw clenched and unclenched. For a terrifying second, she thought he would draw on them, but he held himself in check, his voice dropping to an icy calm. My children are not for sale, he said, each word a chip of ice. And they will not be leaving this house now unless you have official town business. I'll thank you to leave my property. Mrs. Albright's face flushed with indignation. This is not over. Sheriff, there are laws. Decency will prevail. She turned in a swirl of black skirts, her companions scurrying after her, and they climbed back into their buggy, defeated for now, but with the clear promise of a continuing war. Nathaniel stood on the porch for a long time after they left, staring out at the horizon. When he finally came back inside, he looked 10 years older. He found Evelyn in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. They can't do that, can they? She whispered, her voice ragged. They can try, he said wearily. He walked over to her, his movements stiff. Evelyn, I'm sorry. This is my fault. I never should have. Don't, she said, looking up at him, her eyes pleading. Please don't say you regret it. He looked at her, and the sorrow in his eyes was vast. I don't regret you, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. I regret this, the talk, the threat to the children. We have to make this right, he fumbled for words. The articulate commanding sheriff suddenly a clumsy, awkward man. We'll get married right away. I'll speak to the judge when he comes through next week. It's the only way to silence them. It was not a proposal born of love or romance. It was a practical, desperate solution to a scandalous problem. A part of her should have been hurt, but she understood it was his way of protecting them, of protecting her. She simply nodded, a lump in her throat. Later that afternoon, amidst the turmoil of her thoughts, little Hannah toddled up to her as she was kneading bread, flour dusting her arms. The child held up a small, smooth stone, a treasure she had found. For you, Hannah said, her voice clear and bright. Evelyn took the stone, her heart aching. Hannah looked up at her, her dark eyes so like her mother's, wide and trusting. She patted Evelyn's leg. Mama, she said, the word as natural and simple as breathing. The word struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. It was everything she had ever wanted. It was the name she had dreamed of hearing, but now it felt like a brand, a mark of her failure. Her love for Nathaniel, the very thing that made her feel alive, had put this child's future in jeopardy. The love and the responsibility were at war inside her, tearing her apart. Could she be a mother to these children if her very presence was a threat to them? The chaos reached its peak at sundown. The day had been a blur of anxiety and unspoken fears. As Evelyn was clearing the supper dishes, she heard the sound of a horse galloping away from the homestead fast and hard. Nathaniel was already on the porch, his rifle in his hand, his eyes scanning the darkening property. Stay inside, he commanded, his voice tight. He walked down the steps and over to the main gate post. Something was stuck there, pinned to the rough wood by a large, ugly-looking hunting knife. Nathaniel pulled the knife free and took the piece of paper. He walked back to the house, his steps heavy, his face a grim, stony mask. He entered the kitchen and unfolded the paper on the table under the lamplight. Evelyn leaned over his shoulder, her heart pounding. The message was scrawled in a crude, angry hand. It was only a few words, but they were the fulfillment of every fear she had ever had. I'm back. I want blood. I want her. It was signed with a single looping initial *B*. A chilling dread washed over Evelyn. She looked from the terrifying note to Nathaniel's face, expecting to see shock or fear or rage, but there was none. His expression was one of absolute grim resignation. There was no surprise in his eyes at all. It was the face of a man who had been sitting on death row and had just heard the warden's footsteps approaching his cell. The monster had come out of the darkness, and he was here for her. The note on the table was not a threat. It was a death sentence. In the flickering lamplight, the crude, hateful words seemed to writhe on the page. The air in the kitchen grew thick and cold, sucking all the warmth from the room, all the hope. The weary, haunted sheriff Evelyn had come to know was gone. In his place stood the U.S. Marshal Nathaniel Cole had once been. The transformation was terrifying in its totality. His posture straightened, the slump of grief and exhaustion vanishing from his shoulders, his eyes, which had for so long been clouded with sorrow, cleared to the color of wet stone, sharp and deadly. The silence in the room was no longer one of awkwardness or pain. It was the coiled, waiting silence of a predator. "Jacob," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "Hitch the wagon. You're taking the others to the Henderson place." Jacob, who had been watching from the doorway, his face pale, simply nodded. The animosity he had held for his father and Evelyn was gone, burned away by a primal unifying fear. He understood with a sudden harsh clarity of a boy forced into manhood, that the enemy was no longer within their walls, but was riding towards them in the darkness. Evelyn watched as they prepared the children. It was a hurried, heartbreaking affair. Clara and Samuel, their eyes wide with a confusion that was almost worse than fear, were bundled into their thickest coats. Hannah, fussy and half asleep, began to cry. Clinging to Nathaniel's leg, he knelt. And for a moment, the marshal's mask cracked. He was just a father. He smoothed her hair, his large, calloused hand impossibly gentle. "You'll be a good girl for Jacob, you hear?" he murmured, his voice thick. "I'll come for you soon. I promise." He handed her up to Jacob in the wagon, who held his little sister tight. Samuel and Clara were helped in, their small faces pale blurs in the moonlight. Jacob looked down at his father, and in that moment an entire conversation passed between them without a word. It was a look of fear, of responsibility, and of a terrible shared understanding. Then Jacob clicked the reins and the wagon creaked away into the cold, silent night, carrying away the entire future of the Cole family. Nathaniel watched until it was just a speck in the darkness. Then he turned. He walked back to the house, his face once again an unreadable granite slab. He began to move with a quiet, terrifying purpose. He brought out his rifles, 3 of them, and a shotgun. He laid them on the kitchen table along with boxes of cartridges, a cleaning kit, and oil. "Evelyn," he said, his back to her as he began to methodically clean and load a Winchester. "There's a mare in the stable. She's fast. Ride east. Don't stop until you reach Fort Laram. Tell them what's happened." The cold dread in her stomach was replaced by a sudden hot surge of defiance. "No." He stopped his work and turned to face her slowly. "This is not a request. He wants you. That's his game. To take what's mine. You are not safe here. This is my fight." She walked towards him until she was standing on the other side of the table, the arsenal of death between them. "Your fight is my fight now," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You think he'll let me get to Fort Laram? He knows this land better than I do. I wouldn't last a day." She took a deep breath. "Besides, where would I go, Nathaniel? Back to a world that wants to sell me to the highest bidder. This is the only home I have. The only one I've ever had." Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it was filled with an unbreakable strength. "I have nowhere else to run." He stared at her, his jaw tight, a war raging in his eyes. He saw the truth in her words. He saw her fear, but underneath it, he saw a resolve that matched his own. He had brought her here to be a wife, a housekeeper. He had never intended for her to be a soldier, but the unforgiving land of the West had forged something new in her, something he was only now beginning to recognize. He gave a single sharp nod of surrender. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "Then we prepare." The next 24 hours were a grim, silent dance of survival. He taught her how to load and fire the shotgun, its weight unfamiliar and brutal in her hands. "It kicks like a mule," he warned her. "Lean into it. Don't aim for a man. Aim for the middle of him. Don't think. Just point and pull." She practiced until her shoulder was a bruised, aching mess. The smell of gunpowder clinging to her hair and clothes. Together, they turned the homestead into a fortress. They boarded up the windows on the ground floor, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. They hauled barrels of water into the house, filling every available basin and bucket. Evelyn ransacked the kitchen, gathering all the knives and the heavy iron skillet, placing them strategically by the doors. Nathaniel worked outside, his movements swift and sure. He wasn't setting elaborate traps, just simple, effective alarms. Tripwires connected to stacks of old cans that would rattle and clang if anyone approached from the blind spots near the ruined barn. In the midst of the grim preparations, there were moments of strange, heart-wrenching tenderness. While nailing a board over the parlor window, he caught his hand on a splinter, a deep, ugly gash in his palm. He cursed under his breath. But before he could simply wrap it in a dirty rag, Evelyn was there. She made him sit at the kitchen table, and with a clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey, she carefully, gently cleaned the wound. He winced as the alcohol stung, but he didn't pull away. He watched her, his eyes tracing the lines of her face, her brow furrowed in concentration as she wrapped his hand in a strip of clean linen. Their fingers touched, and the simple contact was as intimate as a kiss. That night they did not go to their separate rooms. Sleep was an impossible luxury. They sat before the hearth, the fire a lone bastion of warmth and light against the encroaching darkness. The loaded rifles leaned against the wall within arm's reach. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackle of the logs and the lonely cry of the wind outside. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low rumble. If he gets past me he won't," she said fiercely, cutting him off. "But if he does," he insisted, his voice raw. "There's a pistol in the top drawer of my dresser. One bullet. Don't let him take you. Do you understand?" The horror of his words washed over her. He was asking her to choose death over capture. She understood what that meant. She knew what a man like Silas Boone would do to her. She simply nodded, unable to speak. She looked at him, at this strong, broken man who had tried so hard to keep the world at bay. She saw the lines of fear around his eyes, not for himself, but for her, for his children. She moved from her spot on the floor and knelt before him. She placed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. She could feel the strong, steady beat of it beneath her palm, the rhythm of his life. "Nathaniel," she whispered, "if the morning doesn't come for us, I need you to know." He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a terrible, beautiful vulnerability. "It'll come," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "But if it doesn't," she persisted, her own eyes filling with tears. "I love you." The words, so simple, so long unspoken, hung in the air, more powerful than any gunshot. A shudder ran through his entire body. He reached up and cupped her face in his good hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I love you, Evelyn," he said, his voice breaking. "God help me. I do." He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss of profound tenderness and desperate farewell. It was a promise made in the shadow of death, a final, defiant affirmation of the life they had found together. Silas came with the dawn. They appeared as three dark figures on the ridge, silhouetted against the pale, bloody light of the rising sun. They did not ride in with guns blazing. They approached slowly, cautiously, like wolves circling their prey. "Stay away from the windows," Nathaniel ordered. His voice a whip crack in the tense silence of the house. He took his position at a slit in the boarded-up parlor window, his Winchester resting on the sill. Evelyn took hers, the heavy shotgun feeling like a lead weight in her arms. At a similar slit in the kitchen. The world narrowed to that small rectangle of gray morning light. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. The weight was an agony. Then the silence was shattered by the crack of a rifle from outside. A bullet tore through the wall just inches from Nathaniel's head, showering him with splinters. The siege had begun. The next hour was a chaotic, deafening hell. The air filled with the roar of gunfire, the shattering of glass in the upstairs windows, the splintering of wood. Nathaniel was a machine firing his Winchester with a calm, deadly precision. He would fire, duck, and move to another position, making it seem like there was more than one person shooting from the house. Evelyn was frozen with terror. She clutched the shotgun, her knuckles white, but she couldn't bring herself to fire. This was not real. It was a nightmare. Then she saw one of the men break from cover, running in a low crouch towards the side of the house, towards a window that gave him a clear angle on Nathaniel, who was reloading. There was no time to think, no time for fear. There was only the image of Nathaniel, his back exposed, and the man raising his rifle. Evelyn shoved the barrel of the shotgun through the slit, the cold metal scraping her skin. She did as Nathaniel had told her. She aimed for the middle of him and pulled the trigger. The shotgun bucked against her shoulder with the force of a battering ram, throwing her back against the wall. The roar was deafening through the swirling smoke. She saw the man drop his rifle and crumple to the ground. He didn't move again. A horrified, nauseous wave washed over her. The smell of gunpowder was suddenly sickening. She had just killed a man, but there was no time for shock. "Two left," Nathaniel yelled. The fight grew more desperate. The two remaining men, enraged, unleashed a furious volley of fire against the house. Then a new sound, the thud of a heavy object against the front door. Again and again they were trying to break it down. "Evelyn, the stairs," Nathaniel commanded. He knew they couldn't hold the ground floor. They scrambled up the stairs just as the front door crashed inwards. Silas Boone stepped into the house. A large bearded man with eyes that burned with a mad, vengeful fire. His remaining accomplice followed, a younger, leaner man with a nervous twitch. From the top of the landing, Nathaniel opened fire, forcing them to take cover. The fight was now a close, brutal affair. Bullets tearing through the interior walls. The younger man made a mistake. He exposed himself for a second too long. And Nathaniel's shot was true. The man fell with a cry, leaving only Silas. Silas was a different kind of animal. He was cunning. He let out a wild yell and fired 2 shots upstairs, then used the noise to sprint into the kitchen. "I'll burn you out, Marshal," he screamed, his voice echoing through the house. "Burn you out and take my prize from the ashes." Nathaniel knew he couldn't let Silas set a fire. He gave Evelyn a look that said, "stay here," and crept down the stairs. Evelyn watched from the landing, her heart in her throat, holding one of the kitchen knives she had brought up with her. She heard the sounds of a struggle from the kitchen, a crash of furniture, a grunt of pain, then a single gunshot. A terrible silence followed. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. No answer. With a sob of pure terror, she ran down the stairs and into the kitchen. The scene was from a nightmare. Nathaniel was on the floor, clutching his leg where a dark stain of blood was spreading across his trousers. Silas Boone stood over him. Nathaniel's own pistol in his hand, a triumphant demonic grin on his face. "I told you I'd be back," Silas sneered, aiming the pistol at Nathaniel's head. "I told you I'd take everything." Time stopped. Evelyn didn't scream. She didn't think. She acted. She launched herself across the room. The kitchen knife held tight in her fist. Silas, surprised, turned just as she reached him. She drove the knife forward with all her strength, all her fear, all her love for the man on the floor. The blade sank into Silas's side just below his ribs. A look of shocked disbelief crossed his face. The pistol fired, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the floorboards as his arm spacemented. He grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and staggered back, clutching his side. The first sight of another man's blood on her hands, warm and sticky, made her stomach lurch. Silas stared at her, then at the knife handle protruding from his ribs, then back at her. The madness in his eyes was replaced by a look of confusion. He took one more step back. Then his legs gave out and he crashed to the floor, alive but incapacitated. The silence that descended was absolute. It was over. Evelyn stood trembling, the bloody knife falling from her nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. She looked at the carnage. 3 dead men. Nathaniel alive but wounded. Silas groaning on the floor. The world began to spin. The edges of her vision turned gray. The adrenaline that had sustained her, the primal instinct to survive and protect vanished, leaving behind a black, yawning abyss of horror and shock. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Nathaniel's face, looking up at her from the floor. His expression a mixture of agony, relief, and utter soul-shattering awe. Then she collapsed. She awoke in pieces. The first sensation was a dull, throbbing ache in her shoulder, followed by the surprising softness of a mattress beneath her. The air smelled not of gunpowder and fear, but of carbolic soap and beef broth. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy, weighted down with an exhaustion so profound it felt as if she had been asleep for a year. A cool, damp cloth was gently laid across her forehead. A hand, large and rough, but impossibly gentle, smoothed the hair back from her face. "Easy now," a low voice rumbled beside her. Nathaniel's voice. "You're all right. You're safe." The words were a balm. She forced her eyes open. She was not in her own small room but in his. The room she had only glimpsed before. The room that had belonged to Sarah. But the ghosts were gone. There was only the quiet gray light of afternoon slanting through the window and Nathaniel sitting in a chair beside the bed. His face pale and drawn, his leg propped up on a stool, thickly bandaged. He looked as exhausted as she felt, but his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a fierce, protective tenderness that took her breath away. "What happened?" she whispered, her throat dry and raw. "It's over," he said simply. "You're safe." The memory came rushing back then, a tidal wave of horror. Silas's sneering face, the gunshot, the feel of the knife in her hand, the sickening slide as it found purchase, the sight of blood on her hands. A violent shudder racked her body, and a sob escaped her lips. "Shoo," Nathaniel soothed, his hand finding hers, his grip warm and steady. Don't go back there. Stay here with me." He held her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, grounding her in the quiet safety of the room until the shaking subsided. For 2 days he cared for her with a devotion she had never known. He brought her broth, spooning it into her mouth himself when she was too weak to hold the spoon. He changed the dressing on her shoulder, which had been badly bruised by the shotgun's recoil. He sat with her through the long silent hours, his presence a constant, comforting weight in the room. He did not speak of love, but his every action was a declaration of it. He was a man who had built walls of stone around his heart, and she had, with her quiet courage, torn them down. On the 3rd day the outside world arrived. A buckboard carrying 2 men rumbled into the yard. One was Sheriff Miller from Willow Creek, the nearest town with any real authority. A tall, leathery man with a walrus mustache and shrewd, intelligent eyes. The other was the town doctor, a small, balding man with a perpetually worried expression. Nathaniel met them on the porch. Evelyn, feeling stronger, sat up in bed, listening to the low murmur of their voices. The doctor came up to check on them both first. He pronounced Evelyn's shoulder badly bruised but not broken, and after cleaning and redressing Nathaniel's leg, declared him lucky that the bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his thigh without hitting bone. Then came the law. Sheriff Miller sat at the kitchen table with Nathaniel, a small notepad in his hand. "Heard you had some trouble, Cole," Miller said, his tone one of professional understatement. "You could say that," Nathaniel replied, his voice flat. He recounted the events with a marshal's precision, leaving out nothing. From the arrival of the note to the final bloody confrontation in the kitchen. When he got to the end, he looked Sheriff Miller straight in the eye. "Silas Boone is alive. I tied him up in the root cellar. The other 2 are in the barn. It was a clean shoot. Miller, they fired first. They broke down my door." Miller nodded slowly, stroking his mustache. "Boone, I heard he'd escaped Yuma. Never figured he'd be fool enough to come after you." He looked towards the stairs. "My deputy told me about the girl. Said she's the one who took Boone down." "She saved my life," Nathaniel said. And the raw emotion in those 4 simple words made the air in the room charge with intensity. Sheriff Miller insisted on taking Evelyn's statement. She came downstairs wrapped in a quilt, leaning on Nathaniel's arm. She sat at the table and in a low, trembling voice told her story. She presented Sarah's diary as evidence of the long-standing threat. She told them how Boone's men had hurt dead her and the sheriff into a corner, how they had fought for their lives. Miller listened patiently, his shrewd eyes missing nothing. He looked at the bullet-riddled walls, the shattered door, and the dark stains on the kitchen floor that Evelyn couldn't bring herself to scrub. The investigation was swift and decisive. It was, as Nathaniel had said, a clean shoot, an act of self-defense against a known fugitive. Nathaniel Cole's reputation as an honorable, if grim lawman was unassailable. The matter was officially closed. Before he left, Sheriff Miller paused at the door and looked at Evelyn, a new respect in his eyes. "You've got a good woman there, Cole," he said. "A fighter. You'd be a fool to let her go." When the law had gone, a profound quiet settled over the homestead. The physical scars of the battle remained, but the cloud of fear that had hung over the house for years had finally lifted. That afternoon, Nathaniel hitched the wagon and brought the children home. Their reunion was a blur of tears and relieved embraces. Jacob, his face stripped of its sullen anger, simply stared at the bullet holes in the walls, the reality of what had been risked hitting him with its full force. Clara and Samuel clung to their father while little Hannah ran straight to Evelyn, wrapping her arms around her legs and refusing to let go. A week later they made the necessary trip into Ash Hollow for supplies. Evelyn dreaded it, her stomach twisting into knots at the thought of facing the town's judgmental glares. But as they drove down the main street, something was different. Men on the boardwalk who had previously ignored her, paused and tipped their hats. Women sweeping their porches offered small, hesitant smiles. The story of the siege had spread like wildfire, transformed by the frontier's love of a good story into a legend. She was no longer the scandalous mail-order bride. She was the woman who had faced down Silas Boone's ghost. The woman who had killed one man and saved the sheriff with a kitchen knife. The ultimate proof of the shift came in the general store. Mrs. Peterson was behind the counter. As Evelyn entered, the woman's face, which had once been a mask of cold disapproval, broke into a wide, genuine smile. "Miss Harper," she said, her voice warm. "We were all so worried. It's a miracle you're both safe." She bustled around the counter and pressed a warm cloth-wrapped parcel into Evelyn's hands. "This is for you, a fresh loaf of sourdough. You'll need your strength." The simple gift, the offering of bread, was an offering of peace, of acceptance. Evelyn was so overcome she could only stammer her thanks, a lump forming in her throat. She had been judged and condemned by these people, and now she was being welcomed. She hadn't earned their respect by being pious or proper, but by fighting for her home and the man she loved. She had, in the West's own brutal terms, proven her worth. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land and painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Nathaniel asked her to walk with him. He led her away from the house, away from the scars of the battle, to a small rise that overlooked the vast empty prairie. The grasses were golden in the fading light, and a gentle breeze whispered through them. He was quiet for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his gaze on the horizon. Evelyn waited, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. She knew this was a turning point. "When Sarah died," he began, his voice low and rough, "I thought that was it. I thought the best part of my life was over. I built a wall around what was left, the kids, this land. Figured if I didn't let anything else in, I couldn't lose anything else." He turned to face her, and the emotion in his eyes was so raw and open, it made her heart ache. "Then you came. You walked right through those walls like they were nothing. You saw all the broken pieces in me, all the darkness. And you weren't afraid. You made this house a home again. You brought the light back, Evelyn." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small simple ring of gold with a single tiny pearl set in its center. It was worn with age, but it glowed in the twilight. "This was Sarah's," he said, holding it out on his calloused palm. "I'm not asking you to fill her place. No one could. And I'm not giving you this to have her memory. I'm giving you this because it's a part of this family's story, and I want you to be the one to help me start the next chapter." He took a deep, shaky breath. "I'm not an easy man, and this isn't an easy life. I can't promise you riches or comfort, but I can promise you my whole heart. All that I am. All that's left of me. I love you, Evelyn Harper. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" Tears streamed down Evelyn's face, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She had arrived here with nothing, a desperate girl fleeing a terrible fate. And now, on this quiet hill, under this vast and beautiful sky, she was being offered everything. "Yes," she whispered. The word a prayer. "Yes, Nathaniel, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He drew her into his arms, and he held her as the last of the sun's light vanished, and the first stars began to prick the velvet darkness of the sky. Their wedding was a week later. On that same hill there was no church, no fancy dress. The circuit judge, a portly man with a kind face, presided. The Hendersons, who had sheltered the children, stood as their witnesses. Evelyn wore her best dress, a simple blue calico, and carried a small bouquet of wild flowers that Samuel and Clara had picked for her. She stood before the judge, the prairie wind tugging at her hair, and she placed her hand in Nathaniel's. His grip was firm and sure as she repeated her vows, her voice clear and strong. She looked at the faces of her new family. Nathaniel, his eyes shining with a love and peace she had never thought she would see. Jacob standing tall beside his father. A small genuine smile on his face. Samuel and Clara holding hands, beaming. And then she looked at little Hannah, who was clutching a fistful of her skirt. The judge pronounced them man and wife as Nathaniel leaned in to kiss her. A kiss that tasted of promises and new beginnings. Hannah tugged on her dress. Evelyn looked down at the little girl. Hannah's face was alight with pure childish joy. She reached up her arms to be held. Evelyn bent down and lifted her, settling the child on her hip. Hannah patted her cheek with a small chubby hand, her dark eyes full of love and absolute trust. "Mama," she said, the word ringing out, clear and true, across the silent prairie. "My mama." Spring did not arrive in the West with a gentle announcement. It came like a slow, deliberate reclaiming of the land from the harsh white grip of winter. The snow, which had been a suffocating blanket, receded patch by patch, revealing the dark, thirsty earth beneath. The air lost its razor's edge, softening with the smell of damp soil and the promise of new life. On the Cole homestead, the sound of a hammer striking nails replaced the howl of the blizzard as Nathaniel, with Jacob's help, began to frame the bones of a new barn. The bullet holes in the walls of the house were patched with fresh-cut wood. Like scars on a veteran who had survived the war, the entire world seemed to be taking a deep, long breath. And so for the first time was Evelyn. Her life, once a frantic scramble for survival, settled into a new rhythm. One dictated by the sun and the seasons. It was a life of purpose built not on fear but on creation. She learned the peculiar fussy politics of raising chickens. Discovering the secret nesting places of the most stubborn hens and the fierce protective pride of seeing a clutch of downy yellow chicks hatch in the spring warmth. The work was endless, but it was a good kind of endless. It was the work of nurturing, of bringing forth life from the hard, unforgiving land. She learned to plant, kneeling in the rich soil of the garden beside Nathaniel. He showed her how to read the earth, how to drop the seeds into the furrows with a prayer for rain. They worked side by side, a silent, comfortable team. Sometimes he would pause in his work and watch her, a small, quiet smile touching his lips as she pushed a stray strand of hair from her face with a dirt-smudged hand. In these moments under the vast brilliant sky, they were not a sheriff and a mail-order bride. They were simply a man and a woman, partners, building a future one seed at a time. The blazing western sun, which had once felt so merciless and alien, now felt like a benediction, warming her back and promising a harvest. But it was in the evenings that Evelyn's transformation from stranger to mother was truly complete. When the chores were done and the supper dishes were washed, she would gather the younger children by the fire. At first, she read to them from the worn family Bible, the only book in the house. But soon she began to spin stories of her own. They were not grand tales of knights and castles, but small, simple fables of brave little jackrabbits, of clever coyotes, and of stars that were the campfires of ancient kind spirits. She was creating a folklore for them, a new set of memories to lay over the old, silent, sorrowful ones. She would watch their faces, illuminated by the firelight, Clara's rapt attention, Samuel's quiet curiosity, Hannah's sleepy-eyed wonder, and she would feel a love so fierce and protective it was a physical ache in her chest. This was what she had dreamed of in the cold gray dormitory of St. Jude's, the warmth of a fire, the weight of a small child leaning against her, the sound of her own voice filling a home with gentle magic. One quiet afternoon she found a blank ledger book in a drawer and began to write. It was not a diary of fear and desperation like Sarah's had been. It was a chronicle of this new unexpected life. April 10, 1889. The first green shoots of corn are pushing up through the soil. Nathaniel says it's a good sign. Hannah called me Mama 3 times today without even thinking. Each time my heart felt like it would burst. I look at my hands and they are not the hands of the girl who stepped off that stagecoach. They are rough and calloused, stained with earth and flour. They are the hands of a wife, a mother. Sometimes I think of that desperate girl answering an advertisement in a newspaper and she feels like a stranger to me now. She was so afraid. I wish I could tell her that the journey is worth the hardship. I wish I could tell her that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the rockiest soil. Nathaniel's transformation was quieter, but just as profound. He still wore the badge of a sheriff. He still rode out on patrol. His face set in the grim, capable lines of a man who understood the violence of the world, but he no longer brought the darkness home with him. The haunted, restless energy was gone, replaced by a deep, settled calm. He was home for supper every night. His presence at the head of the table, a comforting, solid anchor. He would listen to the children's chatter, a faint wry smile on his face. He would meet Evelyn's eyes across the table, and in that shared glance, a world of understanding would pass between them. The house, which had once been a tomb of silent grief, was now filled with the sounds of a family, laughter, arguments over who got the last biscuit, and the low, comforting murmur of his voice as he told Jacob a story from his days as a marshal. The ghosts had been banished, not by force, but by the steady, insistent presence of new life and new love. They worked together to finish the barn, and the day they raised the final truss into place, the entire family stood back to admire it. It was not just a building of wood and nails. It was a monument to their resilience. It was a testament to the fact that what had been burned down could be built again, stronger than before. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays over their handiwork, Nathaniel put his arm around Evelyn's shoulders and drew her close. They stood there watching the children chase each other through the long grass, a complete, unbroken circle. The seasons turned. The green of spring deepened into the lush, sun-drenched gold of summer. The harvest was good and they worked together to bring it in. Their muscles aching but their spirits full. The first frost of autumn arrived, crisp and clean. And the nights grew longer, perfect for huddling around the fire, telling stories. The quiet, profound rhythm of their life was a healing balm. Slowly, patiently knitting together the broken pieces of their pasts into a new and beautiful whole. One night late in the season, they lay together in their bed, the room filled with the pale ethereal light of a full moon. Outside, the vast prairie was silent, sleeping under a blanket of a million stars. The wind, which had once sounded so mournful and menacing, was now just a soft whisper, a lullaby. He was not asleep. She could feel the quiet energy of him beside her. She turned her head on the pillow and looked at his profile, silhouetted against the window. The hard lines of the lawman and the warrior had softened into something else entirely. Contentment, peace. Without a word, she reached out and took his hand, his fingers, calloused and strong, laced through hers, a familiar, comforting weight. They lay there for a long time, not speaking, not needing to. The silence between them was no longer an absence, but a presence. It was filled with everything they had survived, everything they had built, and everything that was yet to come. All the words had been said, all the battles had been fought. This was what was left, this quiet, unbreakable peace. Evelyn looked out the window at the endless, stardust sky. She thought of the terrified, lonely girl she had been, a piece of driftwood tossed on a merciless sea, praying for a safe harbor. She had found it, but not in the way she had expected. The safety she had found was not in a quiet homestead or a respectable marriage. It was in the strength she had discovered within herself. It was in the love she had fought for and won. It was in the feel of this man's hand in hers, a steady anchor in the vast, beautiful and terrifying wilderness of life. A profound, quiet truth settled over her, as clear and bright as the stars above. I didn't come here to be saved, she thought. A small secret smile gracing her lips in the darkness. I came here to find where I belonged. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from. So, please share your city or country in the comments below. It's wonderful to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this, and feel free to share your thoughts on Evelyn and Nathaniel's journey.